Today in Belgium, the coronavirus lockdown restrictions are starting to be lifted. This is coinciding with the lifting of lockdown restrictions across Europe. As of today, people here in Brussels can go back to work and they can take public transport to do so, but in public spaces, they have to wear face masks. These masks will be required on public transport and in offices that can't guarantee social distancing. Now, because it's pretty difficult to guarantee social distancing in an office, people are being encouraged to continue working from home if they can, where they don't need to wear a mask. While offices can open today, stores cannot open until next Monday. Belgium has chosen to take a different approach than most other countries. All stores can open on the same day, regardless of size. They're not having a staged approach for that. But there is an exception to that opening of stores next Monday, and that's bars, restaurants, and any businesses involving close personal contact, like hairdressers or gyms. Now, hairdressers can open the following Monday, May 18th. That's the same day that schools will start to reopen here in Belgium. Then restaurants can reopen at the earliest on June 8th, but there's still no word on bars and gyms. It looks like those are going to be the last things to reopen because they involve so much close personal contact. Now, today also, Italy is relaxing its lockdown restrictions. People can go to work. Spain relaxed their lockdown restrictions this weekend. This is a big deal because in those countries, the restrictions were way more severe than here in Belgium. People couldn't leave their homes at all. In order to be outside, you needed to have a permission slip. And so in Spain, the only way to get fresh air was to open a window until this weekend. And now people are being allowed outside for specific windows of intervals. So this is a big deal, and this is happening across continental Europe today. And that is because the curve, for the most part, has been flattened in these countries. If you look at Europe as a whole, we heard from the European Centers for Disease Control that the lockdown restrictions across Europe have reduced the infection rate of coronavirus by 45% compared to the 8th of April. And we've seen that the curve in terms of the number of cases and the ICU capacity has gone down. It's flattened. And that's what's really enabling these ending of restrictions that's happening today. Now, you may be confused if you've heard in the media that Belgium has the highest per capita death rate in the world. President Trump showed a slide reflecting that last week. That's because Belgium is counting all extra deaths as coronavirus deaths, even if they haven't been tested. The rest of the world is only counting coronavirus deaths where the person has taken a test and tested positive. But of course, this is drastically under counting the number of deaths because not everyone who's died from coronavirus will have been tested for the disease. The key thing to watch here is ICU capacity and number of cases, and on that, Belgium has flattened the curve, and ICUs, emergency rooms here, do have enough capacity to take new people in. Now, this is being done in different ways across Europe. Germany is having a much more fast approach to this. A lot of things are going back to regular life today. France is taking a much more cautious approach. In the south, they are going to release restrictions quicker. But in the north, it's going to take a long time. France has actually extended its quarantine until mid-July. Now, these lockdown relaxations are very different from what we're seeing happening in the United States this week. States, generally red states with Republican governors, are ending their lockdowns now, even though the number of cases in those states is going up. So we're seeing Georgia, for instance, opening restaurants and movie theaters, even though their ICUs are at critical capacity and the number of cases is going up. Now, don't forget, in the United States, coronavirus came later than in Europe, and US states enacted their lockdowns much later than in Europe. So for the lockdowns in the US and some states to be ending at the same time as they are here in Europe is quite bizarre, and it goes against the recommendations of the US Centers for Disease Control, which says that certain criteria need to be met before you can lift a lockdown, and that includes the number of cases falling, which is not happening in those states. Now, when we see these lockdowns ended, the reason in the United States this may be happening is because of ideological reasons or even fear rather than public health. We've seen a violent backlash to the lockdowns in the United States, with people protesting, even with guns, storming state capitals. And so these lockdowns may be being let go earlier than health recommendations because of fear of public reaction, even if that public reaction represents a pretty small minority of people in the US. The problem is the government can't unilaterally say that the economy is going to get started again. And this is the problem. There are two other factors here, the virus and people. Even if the government says, okay, businesses can reopen now, that doesn't necessarily mean that people will go to them. We're seeing in Texas and Georgia, where the lockdowns have been relaxed and people can go to restaurants and movie theaters again, people are not going. And so those restaurants and movie theaters aren't going to open if they don't think they can operate at capacity. So the government isn't omnipotent here. And if they do end the restrictions, it's not a either or question of the economy or health, as the protesters seem to think, because there's two other factors. One is the people and their fear, and the other is the virus itself. We're already being assured by government sources here in Europe that this relaxation that we're going to see over the next 3 weeks will undoubtedly lead to a second wave of infections. We know that. The question is whether the emergency rooms here are now in a position to handle that second wave. Now they've had some experience treating this and they know what to expect. Now, the big difference here in Europe is the UK. In the UK, we haven't seen protests against lockdown measures like in the US. People have been pretty obedient, like in the rest of Europe. Those kinds of protests have really not been seen on this continent at all. But the UK had a very different strategy at the initial stages of this outbreak. They first were going for this herd immunity strategy. They delayed their lockdown for a long time. And right now, there are no plans to end that lockdown in the UK. There's not even an exit strategy. And that's because the UK is now the epicenter of the outbreak in Europe. They have the most serious escalation of deaths and cases. And so I would not expect any type of ending to lockdown restrictions to come in the UK anytime soon. And what that may mean in terms of border restrictions is that if we do see border closures start relaxing between European countries this summer, it's from people I've talked to here in Brussels, it's very, very doubtful that the border between the UK and the EU will be opened before the autumn. That's because the UK is right now having such a more severe outbreak than the rest of Europe because it pursued such a different strategy early on. So we'll see over the next couple weeks how people react to these lockdowns. If stores reopen, if restaurants reopen, will they go? And will that result in an increase of cases? If it does, will hospitals be able to accommodate that? If they can't, I'm told the Belgian government already has a contingency plan to have another lockdown whenever it may be needed. And that would be called very, very fast. And so it may be that we're getting into a situation of rolling lockdowns. It will depend on how people react to this slow phase out and how businesses are able to initiate social distancing restrictions. We're expecting a communication from the Belgian government this week about how stores can enforce distance between their customers and stagger entrances before they're allowed to reopen next Monday.